Right, good morning everyone. I think I'm going to get this session going. We are still waiting for the minister, who I'm informed will be here in a few minutes. The sharing economy is the name of this panel. We've got a fantastic group of panelists lined up for this morning who I'll introduce in just a moment. First, though, if I may, I'd like to set a few words of context, and I won't go into too much detail because I know Dirk Pilat from the OECD will give a little bit of a backgrounder in just a moment. As it says in the program, swapping and sharing is nothing new. What is new is the mobile connectivity, which makes sharing possible on a scale we've never seen before, of course, in every part of our lives, working, learning, socializing, basic connecting. I, for example, and there's going to be a lot of debate whether the Ubers of the world and the Airbnbs of the world fit under this umbrella of the sharing economy, but I did take an Uber car to the Eurostar train yesterday. I'm staying in an Airbnb apartment here in Paris, so I'm doing my bit for the sharing economy or the collaborating economy. And that's from a 47-year-old dad of two who needs his 8-year-old daughter to explain how to use Instagram. So if I can do it, you guys can do it too. As I said, Uber, Airbnb, Lyft, Peerby, these are all newish, widely used services that have quickly become household names. We will hear directly from Peerby's founder in just a moment. I read this statistic and I thought it was fascinating. The total value of the global sharing economy transactions reached about $27 billion, and that was in 2013. Some estimate it'll generate more than $100 billion annually pretty soon. So that just gives you an idea of the sort of scale that we're looking at here. For these new innovative businesses, the internet, smartphones, computers, networks are clearly critical. Of course, not everyone has access to a smartphone, a computer, or a network, and this is something we will discuss during the session as well this morning. And just very quickly, the consequences for traditional business is something else I'd like us to look at as well. They are significant. This has all propelled some incumbents to innovate and create in new ways to match or indeed surpass their competitors. Others are being left behind, and we'll talk about those as well. We will also talk about consumer protection. Governments are working hard to establish regulatory frameworks that maintain protection while still providing a competitive marketplace. And capital raising is the last thing I just very quickly wanted to mention that we will also touch on. Let me just introduce our panel very quickly before I hand it over to Dirk for a little bit more of a background. Tatiana Glad is co-founder. Tatiana is next to me, of course, co-founder Impact Hub Amsterdam, a translocal community of social entrepreneurs. Tatiana is described as a social entrepreneur, sustainability practitioner, and change strategist. We'll find out what that means in just a moment. Next to Tatiana, we have Dirk, Deputy Director of the OECD Directorate for Science, Technology and Industry. He's going to kick us off, I said, with a short scene setter. Dan Vedapol, as founder of Peerby, has a background in computer science and theatre. Peerby, I am saying that right, aren't I? Yeah. Is a platform that enables people to borrow the things they need from others in their neighborhood within 30 minutes. How they make money is something I'm quite interested in. Finally, we've got John Restakis, Senior Expert, P2P Foundation. John consults on international co-op development projects and researches on cooperative economies and the social economy. And as I said, we are waiting for Axelle Lemaire, France's Secretary of State for Digital Affairs. She will be joining us shortly and will hopefully be here by the time we have heard from Dirk. Let me hand it over to Dirk Pilat from the OECD for a little bit of a scene setter.
Thank you very much, Axel, and good morning, everybody. I'll try to be brief. First, it's great to see such a full house. It really shows that there is a lot of interest in the topic. I first want to say, this is a topic, and we had a lot of discussion actually this morning already when we were meeting in one of the rooms. Is this really the right term, the sharing economy? A lot of terms are being used in this space: collaborative economy, collaborative consumption, peer-to-peer. I think we'll come back to that topic, whether this is really the right term. I think in my presentation, I'll mainly talk here about what I think are models and approaches which involve the sharing of underused assets and services, which basically are some of the things which Axel was talking about, in exchange for a fee or sometimes free, but directly from individuals. So that's a little bit of a definition, but I think I'll really go to some of the examples which I think a lot of people know about. These are some of the, I think, the many models which we're seeing out there, and I think we'll come back to whether these are all really sharing economy or not, whether some of them are something different. We see them in transportation. A lot of you know about them. BlaBlaCar, one of the French ones, which is really interesting. We see some in finance. We see some around consumer goods. We see a lot around space. We see some around personal services. And we see a lot around professional services as well. So a lot of these platforms are around there. A lot of them are, of course, online. I mean, a lot of this is enabled by the fact that we have technology, we have big data, which is really making this happen and really making this work in practice, which is enabling sort of people to match, to connect, to sort of meet up and really agree on a service which is being then shared. So I think that's a lot of what this is about. This is a very active space. A lot is happening here. Dan pointed out to me that neighborhood goods, which was on the slide, is one which is not very active anymore, and his own company is much more active in this space. So it shows a lot is happening and a lot is changing all the time. I think it's important to say as well that this is something, the sharing economy, as we called it here, is really happening in a space where a lot of other things are happening too. We're very familiar with peer-to-peer electronic commerce, with eBay, also Etsy, which is really sort of around sort of where you buy something from somebody else through the internet in a peer-to-peer way. Sharing is more around, in many cases, the term sharing isn't entirely right, and often it is renting, because you are paying something, you are paying a fee. It is shared sort of services which are being provided, but it is not always really the term sharing, and we'll probably come back to that in the discussion, may not always be the right thing, because often there is a fee involved. And I think we are starting to see this in many different areas, not only sort of around services, but also around sort of, for instance, lending club, where also people are basically enabling, giving away some, or sort of sharing some spare financial capacity to lend it to others. And you also see crowdsourcing here, which I put up because basically there you have a bigger group of people involved. It's not peer-to-peer. It really involves a much larger set of people who are involved in this area. A lot of this is changing quickly, and again, these are some of the examples which are probably not exactly the right ones, but they are some of the big names which we see out there, and they're really changing already some markets, particularly our Airbnb. 25 million people have already used it. It's now being valued at around $20 billion, active in 34,000 cities. Uber, 1 million riders a day. So really big and really happening very, sort of changing very quickly where we're going. I think it's important to say as well that some of these companies and some of these business models are not only replacing sort of what is already there, they're really adding new services. I mean, I think if you look at San Francisco, where Uber is very active, the taxi market used to be about $140 billion, but now Uber already has a market of about 500 million, basically meaning that there are a lot of new services which are being provided here as well. And again, we can come back to the question whether Uber is really the right example we want to look at in this context. I think just to look briefly at the drivers, and I like this little slide about I do not need a drill, I need a hole in the wall, something which at least I find very familiar. Often you have lots of equipment at home and you think like, well, how often do I need it? And in that sense, I think this is one of the areas where you really see some interesting possibilities. I think there are three big drivers in this area. One is economic. I mean, also, I think coming out of the recession, a lot of people have looked much more carefully at basically, do I need certain things? Are there other ways of accessing certain services, accessing certain things I need to do? Also, people are looking sometimes for new ways of using their assets to basically sort of generate a little bit of finance, a little bit of income from what they have already. Technology, I mentioned it already. A lot of the drivers for this sharing economy really come from technology, which has really enabled us to connect people directly. Really generated new platforms, also generated sort of ways of rating, connecting, sort of being informed about what is going on. So in that sense, also technology plays a very big role. And then societal. I think a lot of the drivers as well come from society, where particularly younger generations really don't not necessarily believe anymore. They need to own something. They just want access. They want sort of experience. They don't necessarily feel they need to own a car. They want access to the car so they can use it when they want to use it. Also, ideas of community, of sustainability, of altruism. These are also underneath this. They are driving some of the changes which we're seeing right now. And I think the issue of trust plays a big role here as well, where probably a lot of people now feel they can sometimes trust people they connect to on social networks more than they can sort of trust firms, brands, or even governments. So what does it all mean in terms of opportunities and challenges? And I'll end with this. I think lots of them out there. One around markets, how it is really changing different parts of the economy, how it is also challenging incumbents, challenging existing firms, existing business models, existing regulation, but also generating new opportunities for sustainability, for inclusion, where there are some really new possibilities out there. At the same time, I think there are some risks here as well we need to be aware of. If you have a platform which becomes dominant in a marketplace, you have to worry about competition. You have to worry about sort of also access to some of these services and make sure that people can benefit. Work, I think, another issue we will probably come back to. There are opportunities here for people to have more flexible work, to work at home, to do things in a different way. But again, there are issues here about security, about risks, which basically mean that it may be more difficult for people to sort of defend themselves, to really sort of be sure they are in the same position as people who work in more established companies. Consumers, Axel mentioned it already as well. I think this is something which is allowing people to access a much more diverse range of services. But again, there is a question, can you really always trust what you see online? Can you trust, and what are some of your protection if you are involved in some of these areas? And finally, also around innovation, there are issues we need to think about. This is a much more open, much more collaborative system, and that is challenging also some of the existing ways of doing innovation, particularly around IP. So from our side, we're just starting to think about some of these issues at the OECD at the moment. We have a little bit of work coming out later this year, but I think the real question is basically, how can we use some of these challenges? How can we use some of these technologies, these opportunities of this sharing economy? And I put it in parentheses because we may want to talk about whether it is the right term, but how can we use it to work towards a more sustainable and inclusive economy, while at the same time also protecting some of the rights of consumers and workers in this context? So I'll leave it with that and look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Dirk. And I want to very quickly welcome. There's a seat right on the end. Sorry, Dirk. Thank you. I want to welcome Axel Lemaire, France's Secretary of State for Digital Affairs, who has joined us during Dirk's presentation. I will come to you in just a second. I'd like to start with you because I saw very interestingly, she calls her position the portfolio for imagination, right? And that's something I want to come back to. A couple of other things I wanted to very quickly mention. I should have mentioned at the top. Ysembly is the app that's used here to help you interact with the speakers during the session. I want to make this as interactive as I possibly can. So if you've got questions, burning issues, put your hand up and I'll make sure we get those into the session. There is a question being asked on the Ysembly app, and you can answer that while we're going along. The question is something Dirk touched on. Will the sharing economy help you live more sustainably, moving from owning and consuming to sharing? Press 1 for yes and 2 for no. We'll have other questions as we go on. One final thing I just wanted to read this to you because I thought this was a very interesting piece. Maureen Dowd in the New York Times a week or so ago was quoting the Wall Street Journal. She was writing about Uber, and the journal said there's an Uber for everything. Washio is for having someone do your laundry. Sprig and Spoon Rocket cook your dinner. Ship will mail things out so you don't have to brave the post office. Zeal delivers a massage therapist, complete with a table. Heel sends a doctor on a house call. Saucy will rush over alcohol. Duffel will pack your suitcase. Ease will re-up a medical marijuana supply. Lux offers you personal parking valet dressed in a blue uniform who will meet you at your destination and park your car for you. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And this is something else we'll talk about, you know, where this ends. Axel Lemaire, your position, you've called it a position, the portfolio for imagination. I'd be interested just to get your views first on the definition issue. I mean, it seems to me, when I was looking at the notes of everyone, definition of sharing economy, of collaborative economy, is quite critical, what we mean by this. How do you see this? How does the French government see this? And how will the French government address this in the future?
Well, you're right. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I think you're right to address that question to start with, because we need to know what we're talking about. And I'm not sure that the word sharing is exact when it comes to describing some practices in the business sector, which in reality is about providing online services to make life easier, maybe, but it's not based on the social ambition of sharing. So the sharing economy, in theory, can cover many various sectors, going from the most notorious one is transport, but then also housing, tourism, sharing of services, sharing of products, buying online. Also, why not in the cultural industry, sharing, co-producing music based on a larger community. It can, so there's actually no limit, and it's always based on one tool, which is the internet, based on the idea of a community of users, which is why data and personal data are so critical in that new sharing economy. But so there's no legal definition, there's no limit, which means that the limits, I suppose, have to be defined by the community. And when it comes to governance, we have to provide a legal framework just to ensure that these practices respect, you know, some regulations, but also to ensure that we don't stop innovation. So it's always trying to find the right balance. But to me, the sharing economy is based on sharing, and is Uber a member of the sharing economy? I'm not too sure.
I know the French government, or your department, is going to release a survey pretty soon on the collaborative economy. What is the right balance? I mean, you talk finding the right balance. That's it. Okay.
That's the survey, not completely finalized yet. But if you look at the size, at least,
right,
it is.
And the right balance is in there somewhere, is it?
The right balance is in there somewhere. It is important because I think it's the first time that we are going to have a clearer view of what we're talking about for the French market. Who are the companies working in that economy? Who are the users? What are the expectations from the French people? And what role France and French companies can play internationally in that economy? So this is going to be important. And what can be learned is that, of course, young people are particularly involved, but it came to me as a surprise to realize that older people are also very much involved. And also people living in more remote areas, in rural areas, actually do want to have access to these new services, because it makes their life easier, because it makes them more part of the community, given that it is more difficult for them to get access. And it's also a very young and dynamic sector, because it's almost 80% of the companies created in the sharing economy that are 3 years old maximum. So they're very, very young companies with big growth prospects. So what is the right balance? You mentioned it. Consumer rights have to be respected. It's not because it's new that it means that it has to rewrite everything. And transparency in the contractual relationship between consumers and the platforms, for example, is key. I think access to mediation process is key as well. I was talking to a police officer recently who explained to me that the number of litigation cases is increasing because people can possibly be deceived and they have no recourse. They don't know where to turn to, and some platforms do not offer a mediation service. So this is also important. Maybe labels just to ensure that trust can be found and that the partners are trustworthy is a good idea. A label maybe supported by governments, but that could be created by the business community. So consumer rights, social rights also. The sharing economy should not be an excuse not to respect some basic fundamental rights. And saying that doesn't mean that France is against innovation. Sometimes when I read some news, I realize it's very easy to jump to that conclusion. And the reality in France is that the sharing economy is booming, and we actually have the We Share Fest that was created here is being very successful. We have major actors such as BlaBlaCar, which actually explains to us that it could expand in France thanks to a friendly regulatory environment. And Uber, we've never been against Uber. We've been against some specific practices, including Uber Pop. Airbnb, we've never been against Airbnb. We're against some people using that platform to do business without paying their taxes. And it's always about finding the right balance.
Very good. Many thanks. I want to give each of you just a very quick opportunity to tell us about what you do. Actually, just before we do that, there was another question that Tatiana raised before the session started, and this is the question, and I'd like everyone to have a think about this, and it relates to what we've just heard. The question is, to what extent should institutions become engaged in the sharing economy? 1, not at all; 2, a little; 3, a lot to help guide it; and 4, fully to regulate the risks. So those are the 4 things worth thinking about, and we will come back to that. John, let me kick it off with you, senior expert at P2P Foundation. Tell us what that is, and tell us what your definition of the sharing economy is.
Good question. Well, the Peer-to-Peer Foundation is an organization that researches and promotes and supports the production of goods and services using an open source collaborative peer-to-peer methodology, and it's based on certainly the rise of the internet and digital technology, but it's also based on the fundamental idea of the production and sharing of commons. All kinds of commons, immaterial and tangible commons such as culture and knowledge, to the production and sharing of material commons, water, resources, and so on. Now, my background is mostly in the cooperative economy and in social solidarity economy. And this question around definition is absolutely fundamental, of course. And when we think about organizations such as Uber and Airbnb, and we designate them as part of a sharing economy, I think that's problematic. To me, when we think about how we define things like sharing economy, at the heart, I think, of the question, I think you raised it, is the question of what is the social content of the service? In what way does the service reflect or reinforce or represent a social relationship, an actual social relationship, not a technological relationship, and not essentially a commercial relationship? And so for me, that's one signifier of whether we're talking about something that is actually shared or whether something is sold or rented. What is the social content of that service? The second, I think, area that we can learn from is the work that has gone into defining the operations and the character of the social solidarity economy. And here we're talking about organizations that are basically operating on the principle of reciprocity, of mutuality, and of shared benefit. Also has a community benefit component to it. So many kinds of nonprofits and foundations and cooperatives and so on share these characteristics. And so when we think about sharing economy or sharing services, in addition to the social content, I think, of the relationship, we also need to think about these other elements of control rights. You know, who actually has control over the design and provision of the service. And secondly, who benefits and how is that benefit actually characterized? So when we come back to the question of consumers and their relationship to these platforms, one way I think of thinking about what is actually a sharing system or not is to what degree do consumers actually have control rights in the design and operation of that service? Do they actually have the right to determine how that service is designed and how it's going to operate? And secondly, do they actually share materially in the benefits? Not only in receiving a service, but in the surpluses generated. For example, in a cooperative system, like a car sharing system that's a co-op, like Modo, the car co-op, the users of that service are actually members of the organization. They determine how that service is designed, what are the priorities, and the benefits of that accrue to them as members because they have control rights. That's not the case with organizations like Uber. So those are some ways of thinking about how we designate and determine whether something's a sharing system or not.
And why do we quickly, why do we need to designate it?
We need to designate it because the confusion does a couple of things. One, it fails to recognize the operating principles, and then that has implications for policy, I believe, and for regulation. If we're talking about a system in which consumers actually do have the rights of control concerning transparency, and the regulations by which the operation is being run. That has a different implication, I think, than for a supplier that is a private provider in which consumers have no say or no role. So I think the regulatory regime there has a role to play, but it does have policy implications. The other thing about definition is it doesn't help to misdefine something like, say, Amazon, for example, which is a kind of a sharing system, because I think that doesn't add to clarity around what is actually a cooperative, open, distributed benefit of organizations that do share those social and those community values. I think the distinctions are important because we need to know what we're talking about and who benefits.
Okay, Dan, do you agree with this? I mean, you are one of these companies.
Yes, well, as you can already hear from the discussion, I think it's something very complex is going on. There's many terms for this: a sharing economy, collaborative economy, the mesh, on-demand economy. What I believe there's something bigger going on. I believe this is a transition in how the economy and how companies operate. We're going from a centralized way of organizing companies and businesses and resources and assets to a decentralized way of organizing it. And I think this is a revolution that equals, the Industrial Revolution, where we went to a centralized way of doing business. So there's a very big change, and I think there's many unknowns in this transition. So we see many new companies with unknown products in unknown markets, with unknown business models, unknown regulation. Everything's new, and we really have to discover. There's a big opportunity here to discover and to reimagine, I think, society, companies, communities. But I don't have the answers right now. We're in search.
But as someone running a company that falls under this umbrella, what are your priorities? Why are you running this company? Are you thinking more about environmental impact? Are you thinking about social cohesion? What are you thinking about?
We're a registered B Corp, so we're a for-benefit corporation. And for me, that means that it's just as important to create a company that is viable as that we create impact on a sustainable level, so an environmental level and on a social level. And for me, these three are equally important. So it's not one goal that's driving me. It's really the notion that these new types of companies cannot just be business models, but also ways to improve the world.
How do you make your money? How does PIRB make its money?
Right now,
You don't have to get into that if you don't want to,
Yeah.
but I'm interested to
so
hear this.
so what's interesting about this is many of the models are unknown. So we are doing a lot of research. We're actually testing different models in different cities and different neighborhoods. One of the models that we're working with is insurance. So it's borrowing insurance, protecting these products against damage and theft. Another model that we're testing is delivery. Another model is actually creating a marketplace between the members of our community. So it's still something that's very much in flux.
But sorry, very quickly. Borrowing insurance from whom?
This is an insurance company that we're working with.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And you borrow insurance from this insurance company?
No, you borrow the product and then the product is insured.
I see.
Yeah,
I see.
So maybe I
see.
should explain
Sorry.
what we
Yeah.
do. Yeah. So
Yeah.
okay. Shall I explain what my company does?
Do.
Because maybe it's confusing. So my company is called PIRB, and it's a website and app that enables people to borrow the consumer products that they need from others in their neighborhood. So that way you don't have to buy things you only use once in a while, or you get to feel good by helping someone out. So those are the products that we insure.
Like the drill we saw
Like the drill,
in
yeah.
Dirk's owner. Okay, Tatiana, social entrepreneur, sustainability practitioner, change strategist. Tell us what you do.
So I've been for the past 15 years working a lot with people who have great ideas to change the world. And the question is how to change that into viable enterprises that can sustain themselves. So I'm very interested in long-term change. So the question I always ask myself with trends that come up is what are the long-term implications? And are we looking at some of the bigger systemic questions? So I work with entrepreneurs day in, day out. We have 200 to 300 in our location in Amsterdam. We're in 65 cities around the world. And what I'm starting to see, though, with entrepreneurs is that there are a lot of questions around these decentralized business models, that we're really moving from a time from the entrepreneur wanting to start a large company and grow, to wanting to be present translocally in many places around the world and looking for the infrastructure to support that. So peer-to-peer organizations and looking for new governance structures. How do you do decision-making in those types of environments? But also, how do you really address real needs in the world through these kinds of structures? There seems to be some sense of resonance between new structures and pioneering new business forms with a solidarity economy trying to make a difference in the world. And I still feel, I agree with Dan, there's a lot of experimentation, prototyping going on. So I'm here to learn. I think sharing economy is a really large umbrella term. I think beneath that there are different motivations. There are some people who do it simply to share high-priced consumer goods, to shave resources, that there tend to be some very measurable goals in terms of resource saves, and there's some people who are very much looking for a new paradigm in how we do work in the world.
Do we spend too much time trying to define sharing economy and collaborative economy and these other umbrellas?
Well, I think we need to be in the conversation. What I'm most interested in is who's in that conversation, and to make sure there are many diverse players. So a big question at the table is, what is the role of government? I think if government can be a convener, can be a listener, can be a researcher, and can help to harvest some of the emerging conversation to make it more visible to more people, then I think there's a chance to discover new things.
I don't know how much you look at individual governments, and I also don't want to put you too much on the spot sitting next to Axel Mayer, but European governments, do they listen enough?
That's a very black and white question. I think, it really depends on the people. I think, some people are under, to be honest, high stress, overwhelm, policy demands. They don't have time or they don't have access to some of us, actually. Some of them are really turning around and saying we need to listen to what's happening on the ground. New things are happening and we want to understand the prototypes. So I actually find it really depends on the individual. I find, for the first time in 7 years, it's really, really happening that people are walking in. The OECD walked into our place a few months ago, and this is why I'm here. So I think that people are listening and asking good questions and starting to be in the conversation together.
And how much, Axel Mayer, in terms of that collaboration, at the level that Tatiana is talking about, how successful is the government, the French government, and what plans do you have to work on that collaboration and nurture that sort of collaboration?
Well, I agree that we're now very much interested, and maybe it was a strange, in the sense of foreign world for institutions, because you've been under the radar of official institutions for some time, and I'm very grateful that I could learn more about the sharing economy and the wonderful actors who work within that world. And so the interest for governments is, of course, the legal framework, but it's also, I think, a source of social inclusion potentially, and it is a source of economic benefits for a country, and especially in times of economic crisis. When you look at the countries that went through difficult situations, when there was a solid ground of sharing economy, well, that's a mattress, that steps into the economic situation as a sort of safeguard. So the French government has ordered that study, really listening to the various actors to know what their role is. The next step is to publish a national strategy to support the sharing economy. So that should be done in the autumn, and we will co-produce that strategy with the sectors, so with all the various actors involved. And behind the sharing economy, maybe on the side of it, something that is not so visible is the complementary work to ensure that the country is connected with the infrastructures. So we're obviously working a lot on that. It's providing a good environment for data protection, for personal data protection. It is ensuring that data can be made public through open data. And we have a very proactive government policy on open data. And I'm very proud that France will lead the Open Government Partnership in 2017. Always based on transparency and on open data, because data are used by these companies in the sharing economy. That's one of their key to access a market and create new products. So this is, I mean, we have a very ambitious strategy in the sector.
Okay. Anyone feel free, by the way, to jump in at any time. But Dirk, I want to bring you in, and from you take an umbrella look at this and OECD governments and what OECD governments are doing, how intrusive or not intrusive they are being. What's your helicopter view of European governments? Let's start with that.
Well, I think first, I mean, a lot of the issues which we were talking about here, I think, are definitely on the agenda. I think the topic of the sharing economy as such, I think, is still only on the agenda of a few countries. I think it's really, we do see a lot of work, and we actually have a report coming out a little bit later this year on data-driven innovation, because I think that's part of the discussion here, as the Minister was just saying. This is where a lot of this is coming from, the fact that we now have social networks. Data is really enabling a lot of this to happen. And I think we need to understand better where it is coming from. And there are a lot of policy issues around that: privacy, security, data protection. Those are consumer protection, which is a really big topic for us as well. So those are very, very much on the agenda. I think the issue of the sharing economy as such, I think, is still not very much on the agenda of many countries. And partly it is, I think, there is so much happening in the digital economy. There is so much change. There's so many different models. And it's very hard for governments to keep up with it. I mean, technology is very quickly getting ahead of you. So I think a lot of governments, and I think France...
Is that an excuse? Is that a bad excuse?
It's not an excuse, but I think it is a reality if you have a lot of technological changes happening so quickly that sometimes new businesses are happening, and then you have to figure out later on, well, how do I deal with regulation here? What do I do about this? How do I deal with Uber? And I think a lot of governments are sort of a little bit in catch-up mode in some sense. And I think, as Tatjana was saying, I think partly that is then about sort of convening, bringing players together, trying to figure out what's going on here. Can I understand what I need to do in this area? And I think that is starting to happen, and a number of countries are now doing that.
Who would the sorry to put you on the spot like this, but who would the OECD hold up in Europe as best practice in terms of what the government's doing, in terms of the extent to which they are listening, collaborating, and nurturing this?
I'm not sure if I want to do that one, but I do think there are a couple of countries which are active in this area. I think France is one of them. The UK, I think, is one of them. The Netherlands is one of them. It's not really strange that we have two people from the Netherlands here. A couple of other countries, I think, which are active in this area. And it's partly also, I think, those are some of the countries where we probably see some of these new business models coming from. So in that sense, a lot is happening, but it is always, I think, for governments and for policy, a bit of a catch-up game, in the sense that it's hard to keep up with how quickly things are changing.
Yeah, Dan, I'd be interested to get your view on this, what we just talked about.
Yes,
As a provider,
I would say that. Well, let me not pick the Netherlands because that's obvious because that's where I'm from. So let me pick the UK. Already 2 years ago, I was invited by 10 Downing Street to come together with a lot of other sharing economy companies, come to 10 Downing Street and talk about the future of the sharing economy. And basically they said, we want to support this and we want to figure out how can we create enough space for you to be able to experiment and to build your companies. And I think that is that's a good way to deal with it for now. I mean, obviously, in the long run, we'll have to find out what regulations should be in place. But I think basically blocking the efforts of these companies for now is really also killing great opportunities to create more sustainable and more social ways of business. What I would like to say about policy is what I think is happening right now is that because of the speed of technical innovation, I mean, we live in exponential times. The speed is incredible, and it's doubling every year. So it's going to be almost impossible to really keep up with policies if you keep looking at it from a content level. And I think so. So one thing that is changing is that content is available everywhere. So we basically the ideas and the knowledge are spread through the internet, and what's happening on the other side of the world is immediately available right here. So I don't think we need to study the content. What I think we need to study is the methods that we use to come up with policy. So we need to find ways to come up with policy that enable us to move very quickly, enable us to move in the time span of maybe of weeks or months instead of years.
Okay, Tatiana.
I would just build on that I think an agile approach to this with policy making, but also when we look at IP and we look at protectionism and some of the points that Dirk raised, is that we need to innovate those models as well. Because if we respond to a new emerging economy that's based a lot on creativity, that's based a lot on openness with old mindset models, then we might just stifle that very creativity that is allowed for innovation in the first place, which we desperately need in Europe. And so I have to say, when we put Europe on the table, and this is not from a government perspective, but from a citizen perspective, we have to name Greece. That this is a country that has been in dire straits, and the sharing economy is popping up all over the place. And not just for fun, not just to get a ride somewhere, but for pharmaceuticals, for getting food on the table, for getting rid of waste in neighborhoods. And there is immense innovation going on in that country, in many, many pockets of it. So I just have to put it on the table as something to look at.
Axel, did you want to say something?
I completely agree. Think rock and roll under Thatcher, and think the sharing economy in Greece at the moment. One of the tools that governments can use, I think, is easing access to funding for projects to grow quickly and expand. And based on crowdfunding, I really believe that crowdfunding is one of the way forward. That is decentralizing the traditional role of banks based on a larger community, and especially in a country like France, where individual savings are very important, but probably not used towards funding innovation and social projects. There's a big area to explore. So what I would like to create is a dedicated tool where we could have a matching fund projects crowd-funded on platforms could be matched by investment coming from the public investment bank. We're lucky to have that public banking structure there to help finance innovation and the sharing economy. So if we could match, more traditional banking tools with the crowdfunding system, I think the potential is huge.
And how likely is that? I mean, can we see that happen anytime
We're
soon?
oh yes, we're seriously discussing it at the moment.
Okay, John.
The question of Greece is interesting. I just spent the winter in Greece doing work with the Syriza government there around policy, legislation, and regulation for the social solidarity economy. It's true, there is an enormous amount of energy and innovation that's happening informally within the social solidarity economy. The language around sharing economy and the kind of issues we're talking about right now isn't really on the radar there. It's more around basic services and basic goods like health and solidarity issues around community. But the question around policy there and regulation there has to do with and this is why the definition issue is so important, is because the legislation and the policy environment in Greece has no clear conception around what kinds of policy and legislation and regulation need to be adapted to social solidarity economy. There's a huge gap between interest and innovation and work that's going on the street level and the actual legislative and policy environment in the country. But the question I want to sort of come back to is, and what concerns me is how we are thinking and talking about markets, in this context. And my concern is without proactive information and organization and policy, that the so-called sharing economy and the sort of distributed, decentralized models of production for goods and services that you were describing will simply replicate and, in fact, concentrate the inequities within the mainstream market. And so what we are seeing, it's already happening, what we are seeing is that in the sharing economy you have a huge concentration of control within a small number of companies that are very quickly dominating the markets within which they're operating. And so for me, the question ultimately has to do with how do we democratize markets? It's the same question, I think, that needs to be addressed within the mainstream commercial economy. Problems of concentration of control and power to the disadvantage of society generally and to the disadvantage of consumers. That is what is happening in the mainstream commercial economy in terms of the market. And I fear that is what is quickly evolving in this so-called sharing economy market. So we need to be thinking about how do we democratize and open markets, not only in the mainstream economy, but also in this evolving sharing economy. And what are the kind of policies and regulations that will actually address that question?
And that needs to come from the top, right?
It needs to come from the top, but it also needs...
Or does it not need to come from the top?
No, I think it does need... I think there's a role for government here. But it also has to do with the kinds of models that are being designed and promoted for the distribution, production and distribution of these services. And if these models, in fact, exclude users, consumers, from the design and delivery of those services, what you will end up with ultimately is a concentration of control in that market. So that's the question of how do we understand and address the damaging concentration of power in markets.
Is this something the OECD is looking at? That democratization, not just in this era, but in the mainstream as well? I mean, let's leave the mainstream, but...
We are. I mean, to me, there are two issues here. On the one hand, I think platforms and network and some of the sharing economy allows more people to be involved in innovation process. So in that sense, I think you have some democratization going on as well. At least there are possibilities here, I think, because also digital in many cases is something you can easily get involved in. And I think we're seeing lots and lots of new startups in this area. So in that sense, I think there's an opportunity here for some democratization. On the other hand, I think what we know about network economies and what we know about sort of economies like linked to digital economy, there's always a risk of monopolization, of lack of competition. So in that sense, I think that's always to look out for. And our competition committee in the OECD does look at that issue quite frequently to say, well, do we still have the right balance here? How do we deal with this? Can we still make sure that we have competition, so sufficient competition in the market? I think what John is saying is going a little bit beyond that, because I think that's also about sort of how do you perhaps not only the competition element, but how do you also make sure that some of the benefits of that are really flowing to others? And I think that's an issue which is going beyond that. But the competition side is definitely something we look out very carefully at.
The question of what level to act on. I think the local level is critical, and at least for France, local authorities do have a role to play in providing the necessary services to not only consumers, but I would say service users, and in some cases, public service users. But another level is the European one, which is why the French government has pushed for the inscription of the platform regulation in the digital strategy recently published by the European Commission. By the way, we've always also asked the Commission to mention the sharing economy, because it was non-existent in on the European agenda, and we felt Europe really had a voice to be heard in that respect. But platform regulation, what does it mean? Actually, regulation doesn't necessarily mean, ruling, intervening in the economy. It actually means the opposite. It's ensuring free trade, transparent conditions for market, level playing field, equal access to all, individuals and companies. And it means that we're against the use as an abuse of dominant position that would have as a result that would exclude other potential incomers. In the digital economy, the winner takes it all. So I think there's a risk, systematic risk, of the dominant players having a bigger and bigger role in their branch, which is why the question of platform regulation should be raised first by looking objectively at the situation to see if the current markets in Europe ensure a level playing field to all.
Tatiana, we've just heard about the Commission's increasing role, and the Commission does talk more about a digital economy now and a superhighway, and I think Jean-Claude Juncker talks about the sharing economy now as well. I think those words have been uttered by him. Does it worry you when you hear that, about that European involvement and them getting on top of this and them starting to get it, or do you welcome it with open arms?
Actually, it's somewhere in between. I think it's quite funny because I got very involved in some work in the Social Business Initiative with the European Commission. And I think the opportunity here is that macro needs to speak to micro. Business needs to talk to social. Like, we need to embrace the paradoxes in the market, and we need to get them together in the room. And so for me, what's been really exciting is getting entrepreneurs to talk to policymakers. And how do you bring them in the room? Because they actually share the same purpose. Actually you could look at government as something that's a crowd-funded initiative for social good, for the good of the people. I mean, if you really want to be extreme, then the purpose is very much aligned. The question is, what are the mechanisms we use? And so one of the things I wonder, and I don't know if anybody is doing any of this or any research, is, are we using some of these peer-to-peer mechanisms perhaps to discover the answer, to some of these policy challenges? Because if not, we're actually mirroring the old economy and using meta-structures to figure out the answers for what's going on the ground, and stifling actually innovation when we desperately need it.
And what do you think? I mean, we throw these big questions out there, but we need to start answering these questions. What are we thinking? I mean, can we answer these questions? Are we being too stifled? Is this whole debate moving forward as you would like it to be?
Well, for me, the debate moves forward with the prototyping. So when you look at, you look at PeerBee, you look at Connected, who's here too, you look at a number of the innovations that are popping up in the European marketplace, but also popping up trends locally in other places. I mean, they're addressing different issues. So when I speak to our Impact Hub in Sao Paulo, their perspective is, we've been very successful, we're doing really, really well, but how do we turn competition to collaboration again? When we speak to our Impact Hub in Dubai, it's all about a number of restless youth, high unemployment rates in the region. How do we get people to work? And how do they get to experiment? And they can globally connect, and so they learn. They learn through MOOCs, they learn through these digital platforms in ways that they couldn't before. And this is important to our global development.
Dan.
I believe that we're looking at creating policies in a centralized way for a new decentralized economy. And I believe that there's a very big chance that that is not the answer. That is not the way to do it. So we're trying to look at what should the policies be instead of how should we come up with these policies. And I believe if we're moving to a world that is much more decentralized, much more distributed, that the answers will come from a more crowdsourced way of coming up with these policies, having a more, we now have the technology and the networks to have vast amounts of people work together, collaborate on what the solution should be. And I think we should start using those technologies also in policy making.
Go ahead. Yep.
Can I
and then we'll come to you, John.
quickly step in? I think you're raising the right question, but that's pretty theoretical, because in practice, what democratic legitimacy do you give to co-constructors of policies if they're not elected, for example? So that's a real question. And in practice, believe me, it's hard. I mean, I'm trying. We've launched an online consultation on the digital strategy of the government. We received many, many proposals, and the Prime Minister is going to publish that strategy in a few weeks' time, on the 18th of June. And then I will, from these proposals, draft a piece of legislation, so a bill that I would, again, before it is examined by Parliament, put online, published, in order to receive public comments. But my challenge is to try to reach out to a larger audience, and this is difficult.
Go ahead, Dan. I mean, you can answer that.
Yeah, I can only imagine how hard it is. I mean, we are having the same issues, I think, that we're seeing in building these startups and figuring out how do we reach these people, how do we source funding in a non-centralized way. So I think we're all dealing with these big challenges, and we're still figuring out the answers. I believe it will need time. I'm afraid. Yeah.
John.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've been talking primarily around these decentralized and distributed production systems, with reference to really the form of private economy, which is private goods and services. But it equally applies to the public economy. And the same factors are at play around distributed production systems for public services, right? And so there's a lot of work that is going on now around how to restructure the relationship between governments at all levels and communities and citizens. And the technology that is making possible this kind of access to information and exchange at the level of, the generation of, transportation services is equally possible around the generation of budgets, participatory budgeting, for example, around the generation of redesign for the distribution of health and education services, and a whole other range of public services. So I think that in some ways, some of the more interesting experiments around distributed production systems have to do with the reconception and provision of public services. And so the models that I'm referring to here that have been experimented with are things like, as I said, participatory budgeting, the generation of community-based provision of a whole range of social care services through social cooperatives in which governments directly partner with communities and community organizations around the management and redesign of social care systems, and in which citizens, because of the technology, are able to not only access information, but input information on what is really needed around waste management, around health services, around home care services, and so on. So this whole question of the redistribution of production systems has a huge import for governments and for public services, and which means, I think, a completely rethinking and redesign of governance. You know, how governments actually work with communities and citizens.
Okay, thank you, John. Yeah, well, Dirk, we'll come to you, and then I'm amazed how quickly the time's going. We'll get you get your questions in just a sec as well. Go ahead, Dirk.
Just a couple of points. One issue I think it came up already, how we can better use also data really at a government level. I think the whole issue of open data and really using that much better at a government level is really, I think, something with a lot of potential. The other term I like to pick up on is the word experimentation. I think we're also starting to see some very interesting experiments in countries to actually do a little bit of experimental policy making. Basically say, okay, well, let's try something at a local level. Let's see whether it works. Let's try to really identify whether that policy works. If it works, let's roll it out across the country and let's really make it happen. And I think that's a good way of learning, really, because I think in this area, as in many policy areas, sometimes it's very hard to figure out what is going to work. You need to learn from experience, and sometimes you just need to sort of, well, implement something, start going, and then you learn about it. And that's the hard bit as well, I think, to really make policy. Final point I'd like to make is a little bit what we're trying to do at the OECD, which is really learn from each other, because I think that's a very powerful way of working as well, to try and see, well, what
which
is
why I
working
asked you the best practice question.
Which is absolutely. But I think it's important.
Yeah, no, I agree. Were you just about to say something?
Well, I fully agree. I think the key word here is learning. And what we see these new tech startups do is they build, they measure, they learn, and they iterate. So they have this constant loop of trying things out, prototyping them, measuring what the impact is, adjusting if it's not working, or building upon the prototype if it is working. I think this is the only way to come up with answers when you're dealing with an uncertain situation. And that is what we're in. We're in a transition towards a new time, basically, where we don't know what the rules are yet, and we need to figure them out. And so we cannot come up with theoretical constructs. We need to test them in reality, I believe, and learn from them.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We have so much to talk about here, so any other bits and pieces, just throw them out. Yeah, we'll come to this gentleman here, and then we'll come to you. If you just wait for the mic, tell us who you are and where you're from.
Yes, hello. My name is Henry Rees. I'm Secretary General of Énergie Franco-Allemande, which tries to be a plumber in French-German connections. I start with a compliment. I've never heard a French minister speak so good English. Very remarkable. Really very remarkable. Now, I just saw, I sent a little Twitter thing, and I saw also Mr. Rebsamen, your colleague, announcing the record de chômage, what is that in English, in France. And I think France, as you has everything, the sector. This economy, sorry, I'm an engineer, not a politician, but I find this economy is a mixture between capitalism and communism, and I find French societies also with that a bit. You know, you've got the richest persons in Europe, and also other things, some communistic. And my question is now, you've mentioned, it was mentioned BlaBlaCar, who has overtaken the German Mitfahrzentrale, which started much earlier in nowhere. Frederick Mazzala is doing a very remarkable thing. Have you got sort of foresights what the sector in France could be? Because France has the best, the Fields Prize, mathematicians and so on. So as you said, France should be the ideal territoire for the development of the sector. But does the government have any ideas? I don't know if you're allowed to tell them, but will it be 10%, 20%, or nothing, or?
Go ahead.
That's a tough one. Yeah, I saw the figures on unemployment this morning. They're worrying because it seems that youth unemployment is on the rise again, and also unemployment amongst the seniors and long-term unemployment, which are, the three most critical unemployment situation. So as far as I'm concerned, for my field of intervention, I think there are two possible answers. One is something that I'm actually implementing now. The president decided, and I think it is funny but interesting, to call it La Grande École du Numérique, based on this almost international recognition of the quality of human resources, skilled workers, especially in the IT sector that we have in France, and the potential in job creations if we train young people who are not in jobs and who have no qualification to become community managers, for example, or to become web developers, or so what we will do is from October give that label of Grande École du Numérique. It's like the great digital school to 50 fabriques, 50 schools throughout the country that will give 3, 6, 12 months training to young people to put them back into the system using digital tools, because they're digital natives and many of them have a kind of natural interest to these subjects. So that's my first answer. Another one is, I think online training and training throughout life is going to become really part of job policies for all the governments in the world, because now innovation is so fast. Workers need to adapt constantly. The ambition of school in the primary, secondary level should be to learn how to be able to learn throughout life, and then that this is why we've decided to create a partnership between platforms that offer MOOCs, so online courses, online training, and people looking for a job through Pôle Emploi, which is the job agency. And so we'll again try to close the gap between the demand and the offer on the job market. And the sector, what it could represent, the sharing economy, the digital sector, but from a business strictly economic point of view. And unfortunately, we can't calculate, we can't count what the immaterial social dimension of the social economy is, because it's not part of this sort of public accounting officially. But at the moment, it's around 4% of the GDP. I agree, it could be clearly more. Let's say 7% by 2017 and at least 10% by 2020. That's my guess.
Okay, you heard it here first. Yeah, gentleman here, if you just wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. Christian Reimsbach, my name. I'm working here at the OECD in the Directorate on Science, Technology and Innovation, and I'm also the coordinator of the horizontal project that Dirk mentioned on data-driven innovation. That, by the way, I will be talking about tomorrow afternoon. But my question is more, I have a question and a comment. The first thing is, I would like to challenge the notion of a decentralized economy, because it has been several times mentioned that the sharing economy is a decentralized economy. I think I would agree that there is a decentralized part, which are the peers, but obviously those peers, they require a central service provider, a server or whatever. And I think it has been also mentioned, what is happening here is on one side we are talking about this intermediation, but on the other hand we see that there are some strong players coming in the center. And actually we don't need several Ubers. One could argue one company could provide that, in theory could provide that company. So there is a tendency to go strongly towards centralization. My second question is a more critical one, and I think Madame Le Maire, you mentioned the important role of open data, and also Dirk, you underlined that point being important. And very often we talk about governments as being the providers of those open data. And I was wondering to what extent can we also think about those centralized service providers also sharing their data with other participants? And I would refer also to the cycle of learning that you talked about. And it's true that if we could access the data, we would be able as a society to learn from that. So what do you think about the possibility of the private sector sharing its data with other participants?
Okay, thank you very much. John, I don't know if you want to say something on this decentralization point, because the challenge on decentralization, because you touched on this earlier, as did you, Dan.
The technology, there's a paradox here. The technology has characteristics which make possible the kind of decentralized production and distribution of goods and services to an extent that wasn't possible before. But you're quite right. The tendency is not around, in fact, how actually the markets operate is in a decentralized manner. It's in an increasingly centralized manner because the platforms are controlled. And so there is this paradox around the technology working against itself because of the design of control systems which mold the technology and how it's actually operating. And so I think what we have to, that raises the question of, what is the consumer, the user, and the social relationship to the technology? And that's why I was going back to the democratization question. Because unless the technology is subject to social control and to user control and to the distributed power that it makes possible, it will in fact continue the trajectory of increased centralization and control and power within those systems, right? So there is a paradox going on, but the reaction about how to deal with this paradox is very much a political reaction. Not just policy and regulation and so on, but it's actually a political will to understand that there's a social benefit to be gained from the actualization of the distributive properties of the technology, in fact, not just in theory. Right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Keep it quite brief if you can.
I'll try. So,
yeah, because I want to get a few more questions in.
I believe that the transition that we're seeing is going front to back. So the front side of this transition is on the consumer-facing side, and I believe that side is ahead of most of the technologies that are used to create these platforms. So there are very decentralized and distributed ways of creating these types of platforms, like the blockchain that is already enabling a Bitcoin and could also enable decentralized organizations. But the technology still has to catch up with that, and the funding has to catch up with that. So right now it's only the consumer side that's really distributed.
Let's get a quick comment on the sharing of open data. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I answer that one? Because I love the question. When we talk about open data, we think data produced and opened by public administrations. But the potential of data, of course, also comes from the private sector. And there, we don't have access to all these data. So what I would like to do is create a new category of data that we could call data of general interest. Données d'intérêt général, that's part of the bill I'm working on at the moment, that would encourage private actors to work together and put their data in common. Example, for high-speed roads, or builders in the construction sector, especially for social housing, or telecom operators, or airline companies. The potential economic and social, I think, would be absolutely huge. We're also working on helping financially data fabs, because we have fab labs. I still want to organize a makers fair at the Élysée Palace with the president. I'm full of hope that this will happen one day. So we have the fab labs, and I think we need the data labs as well. Again, putting public and private actors together.
Thank you very much. Let's have another question. No more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Francis Althouse. I'm a consultant to a law firm. I tend to be skeptical and to be a glass half empty person. So could I just ask for some views on crowdfunding? What occurred to me is tulips, dear boy, tulips. What is going to happen when end up with one or two big disasters? A lot of uninstructed individuals putting money into proposals where they lose heavily.
Who wants to take it? I mean, John, let's start with you. Peer-to-peer. I mean, this comes under your little umbrella, right? Will we see that happen? I mean, I imagine we could easily see it happen. And when it does happen, what do we do?
No idea. I mean, the growth, the explosion of crowdfunding, sort of that space, presents on the one hand a real opportunity for people to become directly active in the support of things they want to support. But it is a question of transparency, and this is where regulation comes in. In other words, if a platform is offering access to money and provision of that money to projects in, Latin America or Greece or whatever, the question of transparency and accountability around the information that is basing the investment decisions, has to be clear and it has to be present, and that has, who provides that regulatory function? If we're talking about a global, crowdsourcing platform, for example, I don't know. In any event, if we're looking at the logic of, the private markets, buyer beware. You have the information. There is an onus on the platform for disclosure, right? And also on the project that is asking for the money for full disclosure. And then based on that information, assuming it is correct and accurate, then, the investor has a risk that they're taking. And so if the thing goes bust, then they eat, the loss, okay? The question I have, though, I just want to follow this up. The question I have is, when we're talking about crowdsourcing as a benefit, if we're looking at the crowdsourcing of things like public services, which has been raised, then what is the onus of government and society as a whole in taking responsibility for the collective provision of public goods, like education, like healthcare, if the tendency using the technologies towards crowdsourcing even those things? So that's a policy decision, but also a political decision.
How much of your time does that take up?
Crowdfunding in France is regulated with one objective: to protect consumers. And so we recently passed a text that was in October last year to ensure that this would never happen. But then it's the national legislation applying. So, for example, Kickstarter just launched in France recently. Well, they have to adapt to the French legislation. And I think we've proved that the financial and banking sectors in general are pretty solid, which is also why they were less impacted during the financial crisis than in some other countries. So we've always been careful in ensuring that the legal framework, which is needed, is solid enough to protect the business sector, but also the consumers and savers.
Okay, Tatiana.
Yeah, no, I've asked myself the same question, having worked in banking for some years. With all of its support, all of its money, all of its infrastructure, we've seen disasters there as well. So I think for me, this is all part of that learning cycle in complex times. Is we need to figure out how to be more resilient as a society, and perhaps sharing economy is just that next step to learn to practice. And so how do we react to disaster, whether it is economic or whether it is our natural resources? I think more and more is being demanded of us also as citizens to be very aware of the choices that we make and not assume government is Big Brother taking care of us. I really think we need to be conscious of our choices of engaging in all kinds of things, and do read the fine print. This is how we can take co-responsibility for our future.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, I mean, to me, crowdfunding is really using the crowd. So you're trying to get money from lots of people, and at least what I've seen is that people typically don't really bring large amounts to that. They really use small amounts. So in that sense, I think the risk to me is a lot less than it is from going into the stock market with lots of money and betting money on. So in that sense, I don't think that's an issue. I think you need to be careful about the regulatory side and things like that, and that's happening, I think, at the moment. But I wouldn't be too worried about that point, particularly of people losing lots of money.
Does that answer your question? Allay your fears at all? Seeing as you're a glass half empty person? Thank you very much indeed for the question. Right, let's have another question. Must be something else here. I'm going to come to this gentleman here first.
My name is Bengt Marud. I'm with OECD and with the Swedish regulator. I have a simple question. Why care about sharing economy? You're talking about economic development and there is informal economy. So isn't you, with lower transaction cost, the new technology, everything is possible coordinate at lower cost. So we are talking about the regular economy rather than the sharing economy.
Does anyone want to comment on that? No? Go ahead.
We are talking about aspects of this which are the regular economy. That's the point that I was trying to make originally. There are elements of the so-called sharing economy, which is simply the utilization of a new technology for the production and distribution of services and goods in new ways. But it is the regular economy. It's part of the commercial private sector, and so it's an evolution of that market and of that economy. So it's coming to grips with how does it operate, so we can understand A, how to promote the good beneficial aspects of it, and B, to guard against the dangers. But we are talking about the regular economy in large measure, not all of it, but in large measure.
Yeah, and you did make that point earlier. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, briefly, I think one issue, and it was mentioned by the minister earlier on, is that there are many aspects of the digital economy where the benefits are not very much easily measured. And in a sense, we still looking at GDP, we're looking at sort of the economy, but there are lots of consumer benefits and sometimes detriments. There are a lot of that which we don't really pick up in the way we look at this economy. So there's a lot which is hidden. And I think that's one of the difficulties which we're faced with, that we're dealing with an economy which is changing so rapidly, and a lot of it we have great difficulty measuring. And we're doing our best on our side, but it is a real challenge, I think, to try and keep up with some of the impacts we're seeing of digital economy, which are just not being reflected in anything we see in any of the data we're looking at the moment. So that's a real problem.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Yeah.
Yes, Christine Hattin, I'm a professor in Aix-Marseille. I know it's a bit out of the scope of the main topics, but you don't speak too much of the people who have to work for the main designer or the monopolist or the big players. And how can you make sure that these service providers are not working nearly for free for the main designer? Can you regulate the IP sharing? Since you speak of sharing between the one who get the patent for the platform and the one who have to work nearly for free for him.
Dan, you're nodding.
Yeah, I'm nodding because it's a very hard question. It's something I'm trying to find a solution to as well. I think the nature of work is changing. So jobs are becoming more flexible. People want to have multiple jobs during the day. And I think a big question is, how do you make sure that people still have a good life with this type of flexibility? I believe we will need some sort of policy to protect these workers, but I don't have the answer for you.
Go ahead.
I'll try to answer with two examples. One, and the question you're raising is very important. One is it's about the sharing of the profits, actually, of the benefits. One is the telecommunication industry, where we're asking at the moment telco operators to invest a lot in infrastructures to ensure that the country will be connected in high-speed broadband. And so it means billions of euros having to be invested to build cables, to use the optic fiber, and to build antennas to ensure a good connectivity for the country. But then these networks are being used by all the digital actors, be them, television providers or e-commerce traders or personal emailing service providers, without them contributing to the initial investment, which raises the question, who should pay for what? I don't believe creating a new taxation is the answer, but I think trying to find a way to help that, to ask them to contribute to the providing of a universal service as a kind of minimal service, minimal access to the internet, minimal access to mobile coverage for everyone in the country could be one of the answers, and we're working on that at the moment. The same question is being asked in the energy sector. We have a traditional historic player which used to be a public company, state-owned, which is now becoming a distributor in a world where the energy production is more and more decentralized, and where consumers want to have their say in the way they use their energy and they consume it. So they have to become energy distributor without taking the benefits of being the energy producers, which also again raises the question. I think data is the start of the answer. If they can use data and provide new services, very innovative, on top of the energy distributor role, then that's a source of revenues for them.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm told I've got 1 minute left, so what I'm going to do, how I'm going to end this, is to get. I really want 30 seconds max from each of you on this, and it's a general question. It's a big question. So good luck with that 30 seconds. 5 years from now, how big is all of this? How regulated is all of this? To what extent, as we talked about earlier with Tatiana, does it address those in need? Tatiana, let's start with you.
Off the top of my head, the word I'm sitting with is entrepreneurship. It hasn't been mentioned at all. So I think that this is opening up doors for new forms of entrepreneurship, and I think for people to resolve issues in their own local communities. And I think we're going to keep being creative and pursue, in spite of regulatory,
All right, thank you. Dirk, I'll come to you next.
Well, I would say that this will definitely grow, and will probably grow very quickly. I think what we will get out of it and what the impact of it will be will partly, I think, depend a little bit on whether we get some of the policy frameworks right for this. And entrepreneurship, I think, is a term which I agree with Tatiana, which is a really important one to get right. But there are some other issues around that, and those are important to get right too. But it depends partly on policy, but I think this will definitely grow because there is so much technological change. There is so many opportunities here that people will fill the spaces and get into it.
Okay, John.
I think the need for regulation is obvious already, and it's going to grow. And so the question is going to be, I think, the tension between the interests that will influence how that regulation is going to operate and to what extent. Just as it's been taking place in the telecommunications industries, what is the interest between capital sort of players and companies that have an interest in as market players in the regulation, and what is the social interest? And the balance that regulators and governments have to play is how are they going to measure off the private versus the social in terms of that interest.
Okay, John, thank you. Dan?
I think there's many different scenarios, but I hope the scenario that will play out is that this movement towards distribution is not just going to happen on the consumption side of things, but also on how they are funded, how they are basically how they are regulated, and also on who has the power to control these communities, one might say, so that there's a balance between the individual, the community, the planet, and the organization.
Okay, thank you very much. And Axel Lemme.
worst case scenario is 80 billion connected devices used by happy consumers, but an internet which is controlled by huge private players that have privatized that common good in a fractured world where access to infrastructures, access to information, and education via the internet is limited to some and unlimited to some others. So there's the role of the state that has to be rethought in that context. They're actually the ones, I think, which have to promote a transparent multi-stakeholder system and guarantee that the internet is based on the general interest, including the social interest.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. Right, I'm told that my time is up, so I have to end it there. I want to thank our panel for an excellent discussion, a very candid discussion, a very lively discussion. I mean, it's a very, very big subject, this, and clearly we've just scratched the surface. But thank you all very much indeed for your participation. Thank you for being here. Standing remotely always sends a very good sign, and thanks very much to you for your questions. Thank you.